In the frozen wastelands of Siberia, billions of dollars of natural gas are currently trapped deep underground. For 50 years, this gas flowed west, heating the homes of Berlin and powering the factories of Paris. It was the backbone of the Russian economy, but in 2022, the valves were shut. The pipes went cold. Russia was left with a massive problem. They were sitting on a fortune they couldn't sell. So, they came up with a desperate trillion-dollar gamble. They decided to turn the entire flow of energy around. They are planning to build a massive new pipeline, the Power of Siberia 2, that will carry the gas thousands of miles east, straight into the heart of China. This isn't just a construction project, it is a geopolitical lifeline. It is the story of how Russia is trying to save its economy by building a bridge to its greatest rival, and how this single pipe could neutralize the power of the US Navy. This story reveals the new map of the world. Chapter 1. To understand why this pipeline matters, you have to look at the map of Europe before the war. It was a web of steel veins. Pipelines like Nord Stream and Brotherhood carried cheap Russian gas into Germany, Italy, and Poland. It was a perfect marriage. Europe needed energy, and Russia needed cash. But when the invasion of Ukraine started, that marriage ended in a messy divorce. The Nord Stream pipeline was blown up, sanctions were imposed. Germany built terminals to buy American gas instead. Suddenly, Russia faced a nightmare scenario. You cannot just stop a gas well. The gas keeps coming out of the ground. If you can't sell it, you have to burn it off, literally setting millions of dollars on fire. You have to cap the wells, which can damage them forever. In the boardrooms of Gazprom, the panic was real. They had spent decades building infrastructure to go west. Now, the west was closed. They looked at their ledgers and saw a black hole. They looked at the map and saw only one way out. They had to go east. But going east wasn't just a matter of changing the address on an invoice. The gas fields in western Siberia, the ones that used to supply Europe, were physically disconnected from Asia. There was no pipe. There was only thousands of miles of the most hostile terrain on Earth. They realized that to save their country, they would have to build the largest, most expensive, and most difficult engineering project in history, and they had to do it while fighting a war. The scale of the problem facing Russia was geologic. The gas fields in the Yamal Peninsula, the crown jewels of their energy empire, hold enough natural gas to power the entire planet for years. But geography is cruel. These fields were developed specifically to send gas to Europe. The pipelines point west. When the European market vanished, Russian engineers looked at the map and realized they were trapped. To sell this gas to China, they couldn't just flip a switch. They had to build a physical bridge of steel across 1,600 miles of the most difficult terrain on the planet. This new project, called Power of Siberia 2, would have to cross freezing swamps, dense forests, and the rugged Altai Mountains. It was an engineering challenge that would normally take 20 years to plan. Russia needed it done in 5. Critics inside the energy industry called it a pipe dream. They pointed out the sheer cost. Building a pipeline through permafrost ground that is permanently frozen is incredibly expensive. If the warm gas heats up the pipe, the ground melts, turns to mud, and the pipe snaps. To prevent this, the entire line has to be raised on stilts or insulated with expensive technology. But for the Kremlin, the cost didn't matter. They weren't looking at profit margins. They were looking at survival. They knew that if they didn't build this outlet, the pressure in the Russian economy would build until it exploded. They had to move the gas, or the gas would drown them. So, despite the skepticism and the staggering price tag, they rolled out the maps and drew a line straight through the one country that stood between them and salvation: Mongolia. When the Russian engineers sat down to plan the route for the new pipeline, they faced a brutal geography problem. To get the gas from the Yamal fields in the north to the factories in Beijing, they had to cross thousands of miles. They had two choices. Option 1 was the Altai route. This involved building the pipeline directly from Russia into China through a tiny sliver of border in the west. Politically, this was perfect because it didn't cross any other countries. But physically, it was a nightmare. The pipeline would have to climb over the jagged peaks of the Altai Mountains and cross a sacred nature reserve. It was an engineering task so difficult it might be impossible. Option 2 was the Mongolian route. This involved running the pipe straight down through the middle of Mongolia. The terrain was flat, open steppe, it was easy to dig. It was the shortest path, but for a Russian strategist, Mongolia was a trap. Russia had spent the last 30 years learning a painful lesson with Ukraine. Never build your main export pipeline through a third country. If you do, that country has its hand on your throat. They can demand high transit fees for every cubic meter of gas that passes through. They can siphon off the gas for themselves. Worst of all, if they get into a political fight with you, they can simply turn off the valve. By choosing to go through Mongolia, Russia was breaking its own golden rule. It showed just how desperate they were. They were willing to hand a massive amount of leverage to a small, landlocked democracy sandwiched between two authoritarian giants. They decided that the risk of blackmail was better than the risk of bankruptcy. They drew the line on the map, committing to stitch three nations together with a single thread of steel. For the government in Ulaanbaatar, the capital of Mongolia, the pipeline proposal was the biggest news in a century. Mongolia is a massive country with a tiny population. It is rich in minerals but poor in cash. It is landlocked, meaning it has no ports. It relies entirely on its two giant neighbors for everything. When Russia knocked on the door asking for a right-of-way, Mongolian leaders saw dollar signs. They looked at Ukraine and Poland, countries that had earned billions of dollars in transit fees simply for letting Russian gas flow across their land. Mongolia wanted that same deal. They calculated that the fees alone could transform their economy. It was free money just for letting a pipe sit in the dirt. But there was a dark side to the deal. Since the fall of the Soviet Union, Mongolia had spent 30 years trying to be independent. They built a third neighbor policy, reaching out to the United States and Europe to balance against the pressure from Russia and China. Allowing this pipeline would physically tie them to Moscow and Beijing forever. It would act like a zipper, joining the three nations together and closing Mongolia off from the west. If the pipeline was built, Russia would have a permanent excuse to send security forces or inspectors into Mongolia to protect their asset. The Mongolian leaders faced an impossible choice. They were poor and needed the money, but they knew the cost. They were signing a contract that would make them rich, but it might cost them their sovereignty. They were inviting the Russian bear back into their living room, hoping that this time, it just wanted to do business. To understand the danger of this pipeline, you have to look at history. For centuries, Mongolia wasn't just a country, it was a buffer zone. It was the empty space that kept the Russian Empire and the Chinese Empire from touching each other. In the 1960s, relations between the Soviet Union and China broke down. They almost went to war. The Soviet Union stationed thousands of tanks and troops in Mongolia, pointing their guns south at Beijing. To the Chinese, Mongolia was a dagger pointed at their heart. Now, Russia was proposing to build the continent's most important energy artery right through this former battlefield. For China, this route is a massive security risk. If relations with Russia ever sour again, Moscow could simply turn off the gas. Or worse, if a war started, Russian troops could use the pipeline corridor to move south quickly. Beijing was naturally suspicious. They looked at the map and saw that the pipeline would enter China barely a few hundred miles from Beijing itself. It meant that their capital city would be powered by gas controlled by a foreign power. This mutual distrust turned the project into a diplomatic poker game. Russia needed the pipeline to survive. China wanted the gas, but they didn't need it. They had other suppliers in Central Asia and ships bringing LNG from Qatar. This created a buyer's market. China held all the cards. They knew Russia had no one else to sell to, so they decided to wait. They dragged out the negotiations for years, forcing Russia to sweat. They were willing to let the project die unless they got a deal so good it was almost insulting. They turned the pipeline from a partnership into a test of submission. The negotiations for the pipeline did not look like a meeting between equals, they looked like a hostage situation. When Vladimir Putin traveled to Beijing to meet with Xi Jinping, he brought his top energy executives. They were desperate for a signature. They needed to start pouring concrete to save their economy. But the Chinese side was in no hurry. They knew exactly how desperate Russia was. China's negotiators played a brutal game. They demanded a price for the gas that was shockingly low. They wanted to pay the same price that Russia charged its own citizens as subsidized dirt-cheap rates. This was a humiliation. When Russia sold gas to Germany, they sold it at a premium market rate, earning billions in profit. China was demanding to buy it at cost. It meant Russia would be draining its most valuable resource for almost zero profit. It was like a customer walking into a luxury car dealership and demanding to pay the price of the scrap metal. But China went further. They refused to commit to buying a specific amount. They wanted the option to buy gas, but not the obligation. They were forcing Russia to take all the risk of building the $50 billion pipeline, while China kept the freedom to walk away. The talks dragged on for years. Every time Putin visited China, Western analysts looked for the announcement of the deal. And every time he left empty-handed, the Chinese leadership simply smiled and waited. They knew that with every month the war in Ukraine continued, Russia became weaker and the price would go lower. They weren't treating Russia like a partner. They were treating it like a vassal state that had nowhere else to go. The reason China could treat a nuclear superpower like a desperate shopkeeper was simple. China had options. Russia did not. For 20 years, Beijing had been obsessed with energy security. They were terrified of relying on just one country for their power. They had spent billions building a web of supply lines that stretched across the globe. They built massive pipelines stretching west into Turkmenistan and Kazakhstan to suck up gas from Central Asia. They built a fleet of terminals along their coast to receive liquefied natural gas, LNG ships from Australia, Qatar, and even the United States. When Russian negotiators walked into the room, the Chinese officials could simply point to the map. They could say, "We have plenty of gas. If you want to sell to us, you have to beat the price of the gas we get from Turkmenistan." For Russia, this was a disaster. They were suffering from the single buyer trap. In business, if you have only one customer, that customer owns you. Gazprom, the Russian state energy giant, had lost its biggest customer, Europe, overnight. They had miles of pipes rusting in the west. They could unput the gas on ships because they lacked the specialized technology to freeze it into liquid, technology that Western sanctions now blocked them from buying. They were physically tethered to the land. They had to build a pipe. And since they couldn't build a pipe to the moon, they had to build it to China. The Chinese knew this. They watched as the Russian economy started to bleed, knowing that desperation was their best negotiator. They realized they didn't have to agree to the deal today. They could wait until Russia was on its knees, then buy the gas for the price of dirt. Inside the skyscrapers of Moscow, the panic at Gazprom was real. For 20 years, this company wasn't just a business. It was a weapon. The Kremlin used it to reward friends and punish enemies. If a European country annoyed Russia, Gazprom would twist a valve. The pressure would drop, and prices would spike. It was the ultimate power move. But in 2023, the weapon backfired. When Europe stopped buying Russian gas, Gazprom's revenue collapsed. They lost 80% of their profits almost overnight. The engineers in Siberia faced a physical crisis. Gas wells are under immense pressure. You cannot just turn them off like a kitchen tap. If you cap a well for too long, the pressure can destroy the reservoir, ruining the field forever. So, they had to burn it. Satellite images began to show massive flares lighting up the Arctic night. Russia was burning millions of dollars worth of gas every single day simply because they had nowhere to send it. It was a bonfire of national wealth. The company that once generated a huge chunk of Russia's budget was now reporting a loss. They were bleeding cash. They needed the Chinese deal not to make a profit, but to stop the bleeding. The executives realized they had traded a dependence on Europe, a collection of wealthy democracies that paid their bills on time, for a dependence on China, a single superpower that was squeezing them for every penny. The energy superpower was slowly becoming a raw materials colony for Beijing. Even if the politicians sign the deal, the engineers face a battle against nature that makes the Panama Canal look easy. The proposed route for the power of Siberia 2 cuts through 1,600 miles of the most hostile terrain on the planet. It starts in the Yamal Peninsula, a place where winter temperatures drop to 60 degrees below zero. In these conditions, steel becomes brittle like glass. If you hit a normal pipe with a hammer in that cold, it shatters. The welders have to work inside heated tents just to keep their hands from freezing to the metal. But the cold isn't the biggest problem, the heat is. The ground in Siberia is permafrost. It is soil that has been frozen solid for thousands of years. It acts like concrete, but natural gas moving through a pipeline at high pressure creates friction. Friction creates heat. If you bury a warm pipe in frozen ground, the soil melts. This is the nightmare scenario. If the permafrost melts, the ground turns into a liquid swamp. The heavy steel pipe loses its support and sinks. It bends, warps, and eventually snaps, causing a massive explosion in the middle of nowhere. To prevent this, Russian engineers have to fight physics. They have to build the pipeline on thousands of steel stilts, raising it above the ground so the heat doesn't touch the soil. Or, they have to install massive refrigeration units, industrial freezers every few miles to chill the gas down to below freezing before it enters the pipe. It is an expensive, fragile system, and it is being built on ground that is already dying. Climate change is melting the Siberian permafrost faster than anywhere else on Earth. The engineers are trying to build a static structure on moving ground. They are betting billions of dollars that they can keep the Earth frozen long enough to get the gas out. The engineers aren't just fighting the weather, they are fighting time. The land they need to cross is literally disappearing beneath their feet. In recent years, pilots flying over the Yamal Peninsula have reported a terrifying phenomenon. They look down and see massive black holes in the white snow. These aren't bomb craters. They are Earth explosions. As the permafrost melts, pockets of methane gas trapped underground for thousands of years start to expand. Pressure builds up until the ground detonates, blasting tons of rock and ice into the sky and leaving a crater 100 feet wide. For a pipeline engineer, this is the ultimate horror story. If one of these methane bombs goes off under the power of Siberia 2, it won't just break the pipe. It will cause a catastrophic firestorm. The infrastructure is already crumbling. In Norilsk, a major industrial city in the region, apartment buildings are cracking and fuel tanks are rupturing because the frozen ground they were built on has turned into mud. The concrete foundation of Siberia is becoming soup. This adds a terrifying layer of risk to the project. Russia is planning to spend tens of billions of dollars to build a pipe that might only last 10 or 20 years before the ground consumes it. They are racing to extract the wealth of the Arctic before the Arctic melts away completely. It is a gamble against the planet itself, and nature is beginning to show its hand. While the engineers worry about the permafrost, the generals in Washington, D.C. are worrying about something much bigger. They aren't looking at the pipeline as a construction project. They are looking at it as a military asset that changes the balance of power in the Pacific. To understand why, you have to understand China's greatest weakness. It is called the Malacca Dilemma. Currently, China is the world's factory, but it runs on imported oil and gas. Most of that energy comes from the Middle East and Africa. It has to travel by ship across the Indian Ocean and through a tiny narrow waterway called the Strait of Malacca. This strait is a choke point. It is easily patrolled by the United States Navy. Chinese military planners know that in a war over Taiwan, the US Navy wouldn't have to attack the Chinese mainland directly. They could simply park their destroyers at the entrance to the Strait of Malacca and turn off the lights. They could blockade the energy ships. Without oil and gas, China's economy would crash, and its military machine would run out of fuel in a matter of weeks. The power of Siberia 2 changes everything. If this pipeline is built, it creates a massive overland energy artery that is completely immune to the US Navy. The gas would flow directly from Russia into China, deep inland, far away from American aircraft carriers. It effectively landlocks China's energy security. It turns the two countries into a single fortress-like bloc known as Fortress Asia. For the Pentagon, this is a strategic nightmare. It removes their biggest leverage. If China knows its energy is safe, it might be more willing to take risks. It might be more willing to invade Taiwan, knowing that the Americans can no longer strangle their economy by closing the sea lanes. The pipeline does more than defeat a naval blockade. It defeats the dollar. For decades, the United States has had a superpower that no other nation possesses: the ability to turn off a country's bank account. Because most global oil and gas is traded in US dollars, Washington can use sanctions to crush an enemy's economy without firing a shot. They did it to Iran. They did it to Venezuela. And in 2022, they tried to do it to Russia. But the power of Siberia 2 creates a loophole the size of a continent. When Russia sells gas through this pipeline, they don't have to use the US dollar. They don't have to use the Western banking system called SWIFT. They can trade directly in Chinese, yuan, or Russian rubles. This creates a terrifying precedent for the West. It builds a sanction-proof economy. Strategists call it the Alliance of Outcasts. It cements a partnership between the world's largest factory, China, and the world's largest gas station, Russia. By connecting themselves with steel pipes, they are building an economic fortress that can ignore Western pressure. If the US sanctions China, China can still get energy from Russia. If the US sanctions Russia, Russia can still get cash and technology from China. The pipeline is the physical spine of a new world order. It signals the end of the era where the United States could police the global economy alone. By locking their economies together, Putin and Xi Jinping are betting that they can create a separate, self-sufficient world that doesn't need the West to survive. The construction of the power of Siberia 2 represents more than just a gas deal. It represents the end of a 500-year era. Since the days of Christopher Columbus, the center of the world's wealth and power has been the Atlantic Ocean. It was the connection between Europe and America that defined the global economy. But if you look at a map of the new pipeline routes, you can see the center of gravity shifting. Russia, a country that spent 3 centuries trying to be part of Europe, is physically turning its back on the West. It is ripping up the steel veins that connected it to Berlin and Paris and welding new ones that connect it to Beijing and Shanghai. This shift is creating a world divided into 2 distinct energy blocks. In the West, you have the Atlantic bloc, the United States, and Europe, powered by American LNG and renewable energy, trading in dollars. In the East, you have the Eurasian bloc, China, Russia, and their allies, powered by Siberian resources, trading in yuan. For the first time since the Cold War, the global economy is splitting in half. The vision of a single, unified global market is dead. The pipeline is the physical proof that globalization is over. We are entering a new age of walled gardens, where who you buy your energy from defines who your enemies are. The map of the 21st century isn't being drawn by diplomats with pens, it is being drawn by welders in the snow. The final irony of the power of Siberia 2 is that while it saves the Russian economy, it destroys the Russian dream. For 20 years, Vladimir Putin's goal was to restore Russia as a global superpower, an equal to the United States and China. He used his energy wealth to command respect on the world stage, but this pipeline seals a different fate. By locking its economy to China, Russia is voluntarily becoming a junior partner. Economists look at the numbers and see a relationship that looks less like a partnership and more like a colonial arrangement. Russia sends cheap raw materials, gas, oil, timber south to China. China sends finished high-tech goods, cars, phones, computers north to Russia. It is the exact economic model that European empires used on their colonies in the 19th century. Russia is becoming the world's largest gas station, and China holds the keys. If the pipeline is completed, the transformation will be physical. The vast wealth of Siberia, which once fueled the palaces of St. Petersburg and the modernization of Moscow, will now fuel the factories of Shenzhen and Guangzhou. The $1 trillion pipeline is a lifeline, but it is also a leash. It guarantees that Russia will survive the sanctions, but it also guarantees that it will never truly be independent again. The era of the Russian Empire is over. The era of the Eurasian alliance has begun, and there is no doubt about who is sitting at the head of the table.